I never believed in ghosts until the night I found my own face staring back at me from a canvas I had never posed for. The artist's hand had known me better than I knew myself. The storm had been raging for hours when I wandered into the east wing of Ashford Manor, a place my husband had quietly discouraged me from exploring in the 3 years since our wedding. The servants whispered that the rooms there had belonged to someone the Duke wished to forget, but I had learned long ago that forbidden spaces often held the most necessary truths. Rain hammered against the windows as I carried my candle through corridors thick with dust and memory, each step taking me further from the woman I had been taught to be and closer to someone I was only beginning to suspect existed. The gallery revealed itself slowly, emerging from shadow as my candlelight touched frames that had not seen cleaning in what must have been a decade or more. Portraits of Ashford ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes following my progress with aristocratic disdain. I had seen these faces before in the main halls, had memorized the lineage that my marriage had grafted me onto like a branch from uncertain stock. The 3rd Duke with his military bearing, the 5th Duchess with her serene smile and sad eyes, the 7th Duke who had gambled away half the estate before dying young. I knew their stories because knowing them was part of my duty, part of becoming worthy of a title I had never imagined would be mine. But the portrait at the end of the gallery was different. It showed a young woman in a pale blue dress, her dark hair falling loose around her shoulders in a style too informal for formal portraiture. She sat in a garden I did not recognize, surrounded by wildflowers that seemed to glow with their own light in the painting's extraordinary detail. Her eyes held something I had never seen in any of the other portraits, something raw and unguarded. Joy, perhaps, or the memory of it. And her face was mine. My candle trembled in my hand, sending shadows dancing across the canvas. I moved closer, close enough to see the individual brush strokes, the way the artist had captured the exact curve of my cheek, the particular angle of my jaw, the small scar above my right eyebrow that I had carried since childhood but could not remember receiving. This was not a coincidence of resemblance. This was me, painted with intimate knowledge by someone who had studied my features as one studies a beloved text. But I had never sat for such a portrait. I would have remembered posing in that garden, wearing that dress, allowing my hair to fall so freely. The Eleanor Ashford I had become was always composed, always correct, always aware of being observed. The woman in this painting existed in a moment of unself-conscious grace that I could not recall ever inhabiting. I reached out to touch the canvas, then stopped myself. My fingers hovered near the painted flowers, close enough to feel the texture of dried oil paint, but not close enough to disturb whatever enchantment had preserved this impossible image. In the corner, barely visible in the candlelight, I could make out a signature, J. Ashford, 1848, 15 years ago. 2 years before I had arrived at the Whitmore orphanage with no memory and no name, wearing a blood-stained dress that the matrons had burned. The sound of footsteps on the stairs made me turn. My husband appeared in the doorway of the gallery, still in his evening clothes from the dinner we had hosted for the neighboring gentry. Alexander Ashford, 9th Duke of Ashford, was a man of contained power and careful words, his handsome face trained to reveal nothing he did not choose to show. In 3 years of marriage, I had learned to read the small signs of his moods. The tightness around his mouth when estate matters troubled him, the way his hands would still when he was thinking deeply, the slight softening of his gray eyes on the rare occasions when he looked at me with something approaching tenderness. Now those eyes were fixed on the portrait with an expression I had never seen before. Horror, perhaps, or grief, or both. He did not speak for a long moment, standing in the doorway as if crossing the threshold would commit him to something he was not prepared to face. The candlelight carved shadows beneath his cheekbones, making him look older than his 36 years, tired in a way that had nothing to do with the hour. When he finally moved into the gallery, each step seemed to cost him something. He stopped beside me, close enough that I could smell the faint scent of brandy and tobacco that clung to his evening coat. His gaze never left the portrait. I expected him to demand an explanation for my presence in the forbidden wing. I expected anger, or at least the cool displeasure that was his usual response to any disruption of the careful order he maintained in every aspect of his life. Instead, he spoke in a voice so quiet I almost did not hear him over the storm. "It is you," he said. "It should not be, but it is you." I turned to look at him, searching his profile for understanding. The candlelight caught the silver that had begun to thread through his dark hair, the fine lines that bracketed his mouth. In that moment, he looked like a man confronting a ghost, and I realized with sudden clarity that I was not the only one haunted by this portrait. "I have never posed for such a painting," I said. "I have no memory of this garden, or this dress, or sitting for any artist. And yet the signature says J. Ashford, your family name." He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. A decision made, perhaps, or a long-held fortress beginning to crack. "My brother," he said. "James. He painted this 15 years ago, before I sent him away. I had known that Alexander had a younger brother. It was recorded in the family records I had studied, a brief notation of birth, and then nothing more, as if James Ashford had simply ceased to exist after childhood. I had assumed he was dead, as so many children of that generation had died of fever or accident or the casual cruelties of fate. Now I understood that there are deaths more deliberate than disease, erasures more thorough than any grave. "Why did you send him away?" I asked, though I was not certain I wanted to know the answer. "What did he do?" Alexander moved closer to the portrait, and I saw his hand rise as mine had risen, hovering near the painted surface without touching. "He fell in love," my husband said, "with a woman he could never have. He betrayed the family, betrayed the agreements that had been made, painted this portrait as a monument to his foolishness. And when I discovered what he had done, I gave him a choice: leave England and never return, or face the full consequences of his actions. He chose exile. The words settled over me like frost, each one precise and cold. But they did not explain the central impossibility, the question that burned beneath every other question. "If he painted this 15 years ago," I said slowly, "then I would have been a child, 7 or 8 years old at most. How could he have painted my face with such exactness when I did not arrive in this county until I was 17, when I had no connection to your family until you chose me as your wife?" Alexander finally turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw something that made my breath catch: fear, real fear, raw and unguarded, from a man who had built his entire life on control and certainty. "I do not know," he said, "but I intend to find out." He took the candle from my hand, his fingers brushing mine in a moment of contact that sent an unexpected warmth through my skin. Then he was moving along the gallery wall, running his free hand along the panels and moldings with the focused intensity of a man searching for something specific. I watched him, trying to make sense of the sudden urgency in his movements, the way his careful composure had fractured into something more desperate. When he found what he was looking for, it was so subtle I would have missed it. A small irregularity in the wallpaper pattern, barely visible in the candlelight. He pressed it, and a section of the wall swung inward with a soft click, revealing a hidden compartment built into the wall itself. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied with a faded ribbon, and beneath them a leather journal so worn that its cover had nearly separated from its binding. Alexander reached into the compartment with steady hands, though I could see the pulse beating fast in his throat. He lifted out the bundle of letters, and I saw that they were addressed in a bold, flowing hand. "To the Duke of Ashford, from your brother in exile, unread, I presume." He set the letters on a nearby table, then carefully withdrew the journal. Its pages crackled with age as he opened it, and I moved closer to see what secrets had been hidden in that wall for 15 years, waiting for someone to find them. The first entry was dated April 1848, written in the same hand that had signed the portrait. I am writing this as a record of the truth, in case I am not there to speak it when the time comes. What I did for love. What I witnessed by accident. What I know with certainty. The child is alive, hidden somewhere safe, and she is the true heir to a fortune that others have claimed as their own. I have painted her face so that she will not be forgotten, so that if she ever returns, someone will recognize her for who she is. My brother believes I betrayed him, but in truth, I am trying to save him from a betrayal far greater than anything I could have committed. If you are reading this, then perhaps the time has come for truth to emerge from shadow. The girl's name is Eleanor Hartwell, and she has a birthmark shaped like a crescent moon just below her left shoulder blade. I pray that she is found before those who wish her harm discover she survived. My hand moved instinctively to my left shoulder, pressing against the fabric of my dress as if I could feel through the layers of clothing to confirm what I already knew. The birthmark was there, exactly as described, a detail so private that only my maid and my husband had ever seen it. A detail I had never questioned because I had assumed it was simply another small mystery of a past I could not remember. The candle flickered in Alexander's hand, and for a moment the gallery seemed to tilt around me, every certainty I had built my life upon suddenly unstable as sand. I was not simply Eleanor Ashford, the orphan girl who had been elevated beyond her station by a duke's surprising choice. I was Eleanor Hartwell, whoever that was, whatever that meant, painted and preserved and hidden by a man I had never met, but who had somehow known me when I was too young to remember. Alexander set down the candle and turned to me, and in his face I saw the reflection of my own confusion, my own dawning understanding that the marriage we had made, the life we had built together, rested on foundations neither of us had known were there. But beneath the confusion, beneath the shock, I saw something else. Something that looked almost like relief, as if a weight he had carried for 3 years, perhaps longer, had finally been lifted by this revelation. As if the careful distance he had always maintained between us had been a kind of protection, not from me, but for me. "Eleanor," he said, and my name in his mouth sounded different than it ever had before. Less like a title I had assumed and more like an identity I was only beginning to claim. We need to discover what happened to the Hartwell family. We need to understand why my brother believed your life was in danger, and we need to do it carefully, because if he was right about that danger, it may not have passed. I looked again at the portrait, at the young girl I had been before memory, before loss, before whatever had brought me bloody and nameless to an orphanage door. She looked back at me across 15 years, her painted eyes holding secrets I had forgotten, truths I needed to reclaim. The storm outside had not lessened. If anything, it had grown stronger. Wind howling through the eaves of Ashford Manor, like the voice of something long buried, demanding to be heard. But I was no longer the woman who had wandered into this gallery an hour ago, driven by simple curiosity and the restlessness that had plagued me for months. I was someone else now, someone I had always been, but had not known how to become. I reached for the bundle of letters, my fingers steady despite the way my heart raced in my chest. "These are addressed to you," I said. "Perhaps we should begin by reading what your brother wanted you to know." Alexander nodded, and together we moved to the table where he had laid the letters. As he carefully untied the ribbon that had bound them for 15 years, I found myself thinking of all the moments that had led to this one. The choice to explore the forbidden wing, the storm that had given me courage to defy caution, the portrait that had been waiting like a question I did not yet know how to ask. The first letter began simply, "My dear brother, you believe I have betrayed you, but in truth, I am trying to save what you do not yet know you are about to lose." And as Alexander read those words aloud, his voice rough with emotion he could not quite conceal, I understood that we were standing at the beginning of something that would change everything. A truth that had been waiting in darkness, patient and inevitable, for exactly this moment to be born into light. The rain continued to fall, washing the windows clean, making the world outside seem distant and unreal. Inside the gallery, surrounded by painted ancestors and hidden letters and a portrait of a girl who was somehow both stranger and self, I felt the first stirring of something I had not allowed myself to feel in all my years as the Duchess of Ashford. Hope. Fierce and fragile and absolutely unshakable. Whatever I discovered in these letters, whatever truth emerged from my brother-in-law's exile and my own forgotten past, I would face it. Not as an orphan grateful for the elevation of marriage, not as a duchess playing a role I had learned by careful observation, but as Eleanor Hartwell, whoever she was, whoever I was finally becoming. The night stretched before us, full of secrets waiting to be read and truths waiting to be claimed. And for the first time since I had arrived at Ashford Manor as a bride of 17, uncertain and alone, I did not feel like a stranger in my own life. I felt like I was finally coming home. We read through the night, Alexander and I, while the storm battered the windows and the candles burned low around us. The letters from James Ashford unfolded like a confession written to a judge who would never hear the case, each page revealing another layer of a truth that had been buried beneath 15 years of silence and shame. The first letters were careful, almost formal, as if James was still trying to maintain the pretense of brotherly respect even as he explained the inexplicable. He wrote of arriving at Hartwell Hall as a young artist of 21, commissioned by Lord Edmund Hartwell to paint a portrait of the family's country estate. It was meant to be a simple commission, a way to earn money and establish his reputation before his brother's expectations forced him into more respectable pursuits. But what he found at Hartwell Hall was anything but simple. Lord Hartwell had been a wealthy man, James wrote, but his wealth came with complications. He had married Lady Catherine Pemberton for her connections rather than affection, and the marriage had produced only one child, a daughter named Eleanor, born in 1841. James described the little girl he had met during that summer of 1848 with an artist's attention to detail. Dark hair that curled at the ends, eyes that changed color in different light, sometimes gray, sometimes blue. A habit of humming to herself while she played in the gardens, completely unself-conscious in her joy. And the crescent-shaped birthmark below her left shoulder blade that he had glimpsed once when the child had rolled up her sleeves on a hot afternoon to help the gardener plant roses. I paused in my reading, my finger tracing the words on the page while Alexander sat across from me in silence. The gardener and I planted roses together, James had written. She told me they were her mother's favorite flower and that she wanted to plant enough of them that her mother could smell them from heaven. Lady Catherine had died the previous winter, you see, and the child carried her grief like a secret she was afraid to speak aloud. I remembered roses, suddenly and vividly. Not a specific garden or a specific day, but the scent of them, sweet and heavy in summer air, and the feel of dirt under my fingernails, and a man's kind voice saying that roses needed careful tending but would bloom for years if you treated them right. The memory was there and gone in a moment, insubstantial as smoke, but it left behind a certainty I could not explain. I had planted roses once, in a garden I could no longer see, with someone who had made me feel safe. Alexander noticed my stillness. "Are you well?" he asked, and I heard genuine concern beneath the question, a softening of the formal tone he usually maintained even in private. I nodded, though I was not certain it was true. "Continue reading," I said. "We need to know what happened." The letters grew darker as they progressed. James wrote of becoming aware that something was wrong at Hartwell Hall, that Lord Edmund's behavior had grown erratic in the months following his wife's death. He drank heavily, James observed, and would rage about debts and obligations and the unfairness of a system that gave everything to sons and nothing to daughters. He spoke often of his cousin, Richard Hartwell, who would inherit the estate and the fortune if Edmund died without a male heir, And James began to understand that Lord Edmund resented this arrangement with a bitterness that was poisoning everything around him. And then James described the night that changed everything. He had been working late in the library, he wrote, finishing preliminary sketches for the estate portrait, when he heard raised voices coming from Lord Edmund's study. He should have left, should have minded his own business, but something in the tone of those voices compelled him to move closer, to listen at the door like a common eavesdropper. What he heard was Richard Hartwell making Lord Edmund an offer. If Edmund would sign certain documents, Richard would pay off all of Edmund's debts and provide him with a generous income for the rest of his life. The estate, the fortune, everything would pass to Richard immediately, as if Edmund had died. And the child, young Eleanor, would be sent away to a convent school on the continent, far from England, where she would be educated and cared for, but kept safely distant from any claim she might one day make on the Hartwell name. Lord Edmund had refused at first, James wrote. Despite his drinking and his debts and his bitterness, he could not bring himself to erase his daughter so completely. But Richard had been patient, persistent, visiting night after night, each time with a new argument, a new threat, a new promise. And James, hiding in corridors and listening at doors with growing horror, realized that Richard Hartwell was not simply trying to claim an inheritance early. He was trying to make certain that young Eleanor would never be in a position to challenge his ownership of what he had taken. I felt Alexander's gaze on me as I read this passage aloud, my voice steady despite the way my hands wanted to shake. The words on the page described a child in danger, a father too weak to protect her, a cousin willing to commit any crime necessary to secure his fortune. And I knew, with the same certainty I had felt about the roses, that something terrible had happened in the weeks after James Ashford heard those conversations. The next letter was dated 2 weeks later, and James's handwriting had changed, becoming rushed and jagged, as if he had been writing in haste or fear or both. "I have failed," he wrote. I tried to warn Lord Edmund that his cousin meant the child harm, tried to convince him to send Eleanor away to safety before Richard's patience ran out. But Edmund would not listen. He called me paranoid, accused me of interfering in family matters that were none of my concern. He ordered me to finish the portrait and leave Hartwell Hall immediately. I should have taken the child with me that night. I should have stolen her away in the darkness and damn the consequences. Instead, I painted her portrait, one final act of witness, and I left the next morning as Edmund demanded. 3 days later, Hartwell Hall burned to the ground. Alexander drew in a sharp breath, and I looked up from the letter to find him staring at me with an expression I could not quite read. "Hartwell Hall burned," he repeated. "I remember hearing about it when I was a young man. It was said to be a tragic accident. Lord Edmund and his daughter both perished in the fire. Richard Hartwell inherited everything as the sole surviving member of the family line. But I did not perish," I said quietly. "I am here." The next letters detailed James's desperate investigation in the weeks following the fire. He had traveled to the ruins of Hartwell Hall, questioned servants who had escaped, spoken to local officials who had handled the aftermath. What he learned had convinced him that the fire was no accident, that Richard Hartwell had orchestrated it with the same cold calculation he had shown in his earlier attempts to claim the estate. 2 servants reported seeing strangers near the house the night before the fire. The local magistrate, who happened to be a close friend of Richard's, had declared the cause of the blaze to be a fallen candle and closed the investigation within days. And most damning of all, no bodies had been found in the burned ruins, only ashes and debris too thoroughly destroyed to identify with certainty. James had become convinced that young Eleanor had survived, that someone had taken her from the burning house before the flames consumed everything. He had searched orphanages throughout the region, describing a 7-year-old girl with dark hair and gray-blue eyes and a crescent birthmark, but found no trace of her. He had hired investigators, spent his own money, and then borrowed from friends, following rumors and possibilities that all led to nothing. And through it all, he had kept the portrait he had painted, The last evidence that Eleanor Hartwell had existed, had been real, had deserved better than to be erased by fire and greed and convenient lies. His final letter to Alexander, written 6 months after the fire, carried the weight of defeat and exile both. You have made it clear that I am no longer welcome in England, brother, and I accept your judgment even if I do not agree with it. You believe I acted dishonorably in pursuing this matter, that I damaged the family's reputation by making accusations I could not prove. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps I should have let the dead rest and the living claim what they claimed without challenge. But I cannot stop believing that the child survived, that somewhere in England there is a little girl who does not know her own name, her own history, her own right to justice. I am leaving this journal and these letters in the hidden compartment of the East Gallery, where you will find them if you ever have cause to search. The portrait I painted will hang there too, waiting. If Eleanor Hartwell lives, if she returns, someone needs to be able to recognize her. And if I am wrong, if she truly died in that fire, then these letters will remain unread and this truth will die with me. Either way, I have done what I could. The rest is in God's hands, and perhaps in yours, brother, if you ever choose to look for answers instead of order. The letter ended there, with no signature, no farewell, just the abrupt silence of a man who had said everything he needed to say and had nothing left to offer but hope and distance. Alexander set down the final page with careful precision, as if it were something fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. The candles had burned down to stubs, and the first gray light of dawn was beginning to seep through the windows, turning the portraits on the walls from shadow into substance. We sat in silence for a long moment, both of us absorbing the implications of what we had read, the way James's confession had reshaped the past and therefore the present, and therefore everything that would come after. When Alexander finally spoke, his voice was rough with exhaustion and something deeper. I sent him away because he was pursuing you, Eleanor, or the idea of you. He came to me 3 years ago, just after I had announced my intention to marry. He had heard somehow that I was courting an orphan girl named Eleanor, who had no memory of her childhood, and he was convinced you were the Hartwell child he had been searching for. He begged me to investigate your past, to look for evidence of your identity before I committed to the marriage. I refused. I thought he was mad with obsession, seeing patterns where there were none, trying to disrupt my life because he resented the responsibilities I had inherited, and he had escaped. He stood and moved to the window, his back to me, his shoulders rigid with tension. I gave him a choice, Alexander continued. Leave England and never contact me again, or I would have him committed to an asylum for his own protection and the family's reputation. He chose exile, and I chose you, Eleanor, because you were kind and intelligent and needed someone to care for you. I chose you because you did not demand things of me, did not expect grand passions or romantic gestures. I chose you because I thought you would be safe with me, that I could give you the security and respect you deserved without the complications that come with deeper entanglements. I listened to this confession with a strange calm settling over me. Part of me had always known that Alexander's proposal had been more practical than passionate, that our marriage was built on mutual benefit rather than overwhelming emotion. He needed an heir and a duchess who would not challenge his authority. I needed safety and belonging and a place in the world that was mine by right rather than charity. We had both gotten what we needed, and if there was no great love between us, there was at least kindness and consideration and the slow building of something that might one day become genuine affection. But now, standing in the dawn light with the truth of my identity laid bare between us, I understood that our careful arrangement had been built on foundations neither of us had chosen to examine too closely. Alexander had married me, knowing his brother believed I was Eleanor Hartwell. He had dismissed James's certainty as madness, but some part of him must have wondered. Some part of him must have looked at my face and seen the girl in the portrait, must have noticed the crescent birthmark and remembered his brother's description, must have recognized the possibility, even as he chose to ignore it. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked. "When James came to you with his suspicions, why did you not ask me about my past, about what I remembered, about the possibility that I might be someone other than an unnamed orphan?" Alexander turned from the window to face me, and in the growing light I saw how tired he looked, how the weight of this revelation had aged him overnight. "Because I was afraid," he said simply, "afraid of what we might discover. Afraid that if you were Eleanor Hartwell, you would have claims and rights and a fortune that was stolen from you. Afraid that Richard Hartwell, if he learned you had survived, would finish what he started 15 years ago. And afraid, God help me, that if I helped you discover who you really were, you would no longer need me, would no longer choose to remain in a marriage that was convenient rather than passionate." The honesty of this admission struck me harder than any accusation could have. I stood and crossed the gallery to where he stood by the window, close enough to see the vulnerability in his eyes, the way his usual armor of ducal composure had been stripped away by exhaustion and truth both. For 3 years, Alexander had been careful with me, maintaining a respectful distance even in our most intimate moments, treating me with a courtesy that sometimes felt more like formality than affection. I had assumed it was simply his nature, the reserve of a man raised to rule rather than relate. Now I understood it was protection, a way of keeping both of us safe from entanglements that might become too complicated, too dangerous, too real. "I am still Eleanor," I said quietly. "Whatever else I learn about my past, whatever claims I might have to names and fortunes that were taken from me, I am still the woman you married, the woman who has shared your home and your name for 3 years. That does not change because we now know my history began before the orphanage." Alexander's hand rose as if to touch my face, then stopped midway, hovering in the space between intention and action. "But everything has changed," he said. "You are not simply an orphan I elevated to the position of Duchess. You are Eleanor Hartwell, rightful heir to a fortune that Richard Hartwell stole through murder and deception. You have the right to reclaim what was taken from you. You have the right to seek justice for your father's death and your own erasure. And God help me, I should have helped you discover this 3 years ago instead of protecting my own peace by keeping you ignorant." I reached up and caught his hand, pulling it down to rest against my cheek, committing to the gesture he had hesitated to complete. The touch was warm, solid, real, in a way that grounded me against the vertigo of revelation. "You could not have known for certain," I said. "James's evidence was compelling, but not conclusive. And perhaps I was not ready 3 years ago to face what I am ready to face now. Perhaps we both needed these years of careful distance to build enough trust that we could weather this storm together." His fingers curled against my skin, a tentative caress that felt like permission and question both. "What do you want to do, Eleanor?" he asked. "Do you want to pursue this? To investigate Richard Hartwell? To try to reclaim your inheritance? To risk everything we have built for the sake of justice and truth?" I thought about the portrait of the child in the garden, planting roses with her mother's memory held close. I thought about the father who had been too weak to protect her, but had loved her nonetheless. I thought about the fortune that had been stolen, the life that had been taken, the years I had spent not knowing who I was or where I had come from. And I thought about the danger James had warned of, the reality that Richard Hartwell had committed murder once and might well do so again if he learned I had survived. "Yes," I said. "I want to know the truth. I want to understand what happened that night at Hartwell Hall. I want to face the man who tried to kill me and see if he recognizes the child he thought he had erased. But I do not want to do it alone, Alexander. I want you with me, not as my protector or my keeper, but as my partner in this. Can you give me that?" He studied my face for a long moment, and I saw the decision forming behind his eyes, the way he was choosing to step beyond the careful boundaries we had maintained for 3 years. Then he leaned forward and kissed me, a kiss that was nothing like the chaste affection we had shared on our wedding day, or the dutiful intimacy of our occasional couplings. This kiss was claim and promise both, an acknowledgement that whatever we discovered in the days ahead, we would face it together as something more than a marriage of convenience. When we drew apart, both breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against mine. "We will need to be careful," he said. "If Richard Hartwell learns that you are alive, he will move against us. We need evidence, witnesses, proof that will stand up in court before we confront him. And we need to find James, to bring him home from exile so he can testify to what he witnessed." I nodded, my mind already racing ahead to the challenges before us. "Where is Richard Hartwell now?" I asked. "Does he still own the Hartwell estate?" Alexander's expression darkened. He sold the estate 10 years ago and used the money to establish himself in London society. He is well-connected, wealthy, respected. He has married well and has children of his own now. By all accounts, he is a pillar of respectability, beyond suspicion or scandal. Taking him down will not be simple or quick or clean. Then we begin with research, I said. We find the servants who escaped the fire. We locate the magistrate who closed the investigation and discover what Richard paid him for his cooperation. We build our case piece by piece until we have something so solid that even London society cannot ignore it. And we do it quietly, without alerting Richard that we are coming for him. Alexander smiled then, a real smile that transformed his usually stern features into something younger and less burdened. "You are more formidable than I gave you credit for, Eleanor Hartwell. I begin to think my brother chose well when he painted your portrait all those years ago. The use of my true name, spoken with such certainty, sent a thrill through me that was part fear and part fierce joy. For 3 years I had been Eleanor Ashford, a name I wore like borrowed clothes that never quite fit properly. Now I was reclaiming Eleanor Hartwell, becoming someone I had been before memory, before loss, before the fire that had tried to erase me from existence. The sun had fully risen by the time we left the East Gallery, both of us exhausted, but strangely energized by the night's revelations. We carried James's letters and journal with us, precious evidence that would need to be kept safe as we pursued the truth. The portrait we left hanging in the gallery, a silent witness to everything we had discovered, everything we intended to do. As we walked back through the corridors toward the inhabited wings of Ashford Manor, Alexander's hand found mine, our fingers interlacing in a gesture of unity we had rarely shared before. The servants would be rising soon, beginning their daily routines, and we would need to maintain the appearance of normalcy while we conducted our investigation in secret. But in this moment, in the quiet dawn after a night of revelation, we allowed ourselves to be simply Eleanor and Alexander, husband and wife, bound now by something more than duty or convenience. We had become partners in truth-seeking, allies in justice, and perhaps, if we were very lucky, something even deeper than that. The days ahead would be dangerous. Richard Hartwell had killed once and would not hesitate to kill again if he felt threatened. We would need to be careful, strategic, patient in ways that went against every instinct that wanted immediate confrontation and swift justice. But I had spent 15 years surviving without knowing why I needed to survive, had built a life from nothing, with only my own determination and the kindness of strangers to guide me. Now I knew why I had survived. Now I had a purpose beyond simply enduring. I was Eleanor Hartwell, and I had come home to claim what was mine, to face what had been hidden, to speak the truths that others had tried to bury in fire and ash and convenient lies, and I would not be erased again. The investigation began quietly, like all dangerous things must, when conducted beneath the eyes of those who would prefer the truth remain buried. Alexander sent word to his solicitors in London, requesting documents related to the Hartwell estate sale and any records of Lord Edmund's debts that might reveal the extent of Richard's financial motivations. I began writing letters under a false name, reaching out to employment agencies and servant registries in the counties surrounding the ruins of Hartwell Hall, seeking anyone who might remember working there in the months before the fire. We told no one at Ashford Manor about what we had discovered. To the household staff, to the neighboring gentry who called for tea or sent invitations to dinner, we remained the Duke and Duchess of Ashford, conducting our lives with the same careful propriety we had always maintained. But in the privacy of Alexander's study in the evenings, after the servants had retired and the house settled into silence, we became something else entirely. Conspirators, investigators, partners in a pursuit that grew more complex with each new piece of information we uncovered. 3 weeks after our discovery in the East Gallery, I received my first response to the letters I had sent. The envelope arrived with the afternoon post, addressed to Miss E. Whitmore at a postal box I had rented in the nearby market town. The return address indicated it came from a Mrs. Martha Bennet in Cornwall, and as I broke the seal and unfolded the pages inside, my hands trembled with anticipation and dread both. Dear Miss Whitmore, the letter began in a careful, educated hand. I was surprised to receive your inquiry regarding employment at Hartwell Hall, as I had not thought of that place in many years and had rather hoped never to be reminded of it. However, your questions suggest you seek truth rather than idle gossip, and after much consideration, I have decided that perhaps the time has come for certain truths to be spoken aloud. I was housekeeper at Hartwell Hall from 1845 until the night of the fire in 1848, and what I witnessed during those years weighs on my conscience still. I read on, my heart pounding as Mrs. Bennet described the household she had managed during the years of my childhood. She wrote of Lady Catherine's kindness, of Lord Edmund's descent into drinking and debt after his wife's death, of the little girl who had wandered the gardens alone, talking to roses as if they were friends who might understand her loneliness. She wrote of Richard Hartwell's frequent visits, of the conversations she had overheard through closed doors, of her growing conviction that something terrible was being planned. The night of the fire, Mrs. Bennet wrote, I was awakened by the smell of smoke and found the east wing already engulfed in flames. I ran to wake Lord Edmund and discovered him unconscious in his study, a half-empty bottle of laudanum on his desk beside him. The dose would have been enough to kill a man of stronger constitution, but Lord Edmund had built up a tolerance to such things through his habitual use of the drug. I managed to drag him outside before the smoke overcame me, but I could not reach the child's room. The servants who tried to get to the nursery were driven back by the flames. We all assumed little Eleanor had perished in the blaze, and I have carried the guilt of that assumption for 15 years. But here is what I have never told anyone, Miss Whitmore, because I feared the consequences of speaking against a man as powerful and connected as Richard Hartwell. 2 days before the fire, I saw Mr. Hartwell in conversation with a man I did not recognize, a rough-looking fellow who did not belong in a gentleman's house. They were standing in the garden near the kitchen entrance, and I heard Mr. Hartwell say that certain arrangements had been made and that the gentleman needed to be away from the house on the night in question for his own safety and convenience. I thought nothing of it at the time, assumed it was some business matter I did not understand. But after the fire, when Lord Edmund survived but swore he remembered nothing of that night, when the magistrate declared it an accident so quickly despite the suspicious circumstances, I began to understand what I had witnessed. I believe Richard Hartwell paid someone to set that fire, Miss Whitmore. I believe he drugged Lord Edmund to ensure he would not wake to stop it. And I believe he meant for both father and daughter to die in the flames so that he could claim the Hartwell fortune without challenge or complication. If you are investigating this matter, as your letter suggests you are, then I urge you to be careful. Mr. Hartwell has become a man of considerable power since that night, and he will not hesitate to protect what he has gained through such terrible means. The letter ended with an offer to meet in person if I wished to hear more, though Mrs. Bennet made it clear she would only do so if I could guarantee her safety from Richard Hartwell's reach. I set down the pages with shaking hands and looked up to find Alexander watching me from across the study. his expression intent. "What does she say?" he asked, and I passed him the letter without speaking, needing him to read Mrs. Bennet's words for himself, to understand the weight of what we had just received. He read in silence, his jaw tightening with each paragraph, and when he finished, he set the letter down with the same careful control he applied to everything that threatened to overwhelm him. "This is the evidence we needed," he said. "A witness who can testify to Richard's presence at Hartwell Hall before the fire, to his suspicious behavior, to the laudanum that was used to incapacitate your father. Combined with James's testimony about the conversations he overheard, we have the beginning of a case against Richard Hartwell." "But it is not enough," I said, voicing the concern that had been growing in my mind as I read Mrs. Bennet's account. A housekeeper's testimony about a conversation she overheard 15 years ago. An exiled brother's journal entries written by a man who has been called mad and obsessed. Richard's lawyers will tear both of them apart in court. We need more. We need the man Richard paid to set the fire. We need the magistrate who closed the investigation to admit he was bribed. We need something so damning that even Richard's connections and wealth cannot protect him. Alexander stood and moved to the window, a habit he had developed during our weeks of investigation, as if looking out at the estate grounds helped him think more clearly. "Finding the man who set the fire will be nearly impossible after 15 years, he said. "But the magistrate might be a different matter. Men who accept bribes rarely stop at one. If we can find evidence of other corruptions, other cases where he showed favoritism to Richard or his associates, we might be able to leverage that information into a confession." I joined him at the window, standing close enough that our shoulders touched, a casual intimacy we had fallen into during these weeks of partnership. "What was the magistrate's name?" I asked. "Is he still alive?" "Sir George Pemberton," Alexander replied. "And yes, he is very much alive and currently serving as a justice of the peace in London. He retired from his position in the county a decade ago. Coincidentally, around the same time, Richard sold the Hartwell estate and moved to London society. The timing of that dual transition has not escaped my notice." "Nor mine," I said. "It suggests an ongoing relationship between them, a continued alliance that might give us leverage if we approach it correctly. Can you arrange for us to travel to London? I would like to see Sir George Pemberton for myself, to observe him and understand what kind of man we are dealing with before we attempt to extract a confession from him." Alexander turned to look at me, and in his eyes I saw both concern and something that might have been pride. "You understand that by going to London, by putting ourselves in the same city as Richard Hartwell, we are exposing you to considerable danger," he said. "If he learns you are alive, if he suspects that we are investigating him, he will move against us." "I know," I replied, "but we cannot build our case from a distance forever. At some point, we must confront the man who tried to kill me, and I would rather do so on our terms, with preparation and evidence, than wait for him to discover my survival on his own. Besides, the London season is approaching. It would not be unusual for the Duke and Duchess of Ashford to spend a few weeks in town. We can conduct our investigation while maintaining the appearance of social obligation." Alexander studied my face for a long moment, and I met his gaze steadily, letting him see the determination I felt, the resolve that had been building with each new piece of evidence we uncovered. Over the weeks of our investigation, something had shifted between us, the careful distance of our early marriage giving way to genuine partnership, and something deeper I was only beginning to name. He no longer treated me as a duchess he had chosen for practical reasons, but as an equal whose intelligence and courage matched his own. And I no longer saw him as simply the duke who had elevated me from obscurity, but as a man of surprising depth and carefully guarded tenderness. "Very well," he said finally. "We will go to London. But we go carefully, Eleanor. We maintain our usual social calendar, attend the expected dinners and balls, give Richard no reason to suspect that we are anything other than what we appear to be. And we keep Mrs. Bennet's letter and James's journal locked away safely, where they cannot be stolen or destroyed." I nodded my agreement, and then, on impulse, I reached up and touched his face, tracing the line of his jaw with my fingertips in a gesture that was neither dutiful nor formal, but simply affectionate. "Thank you," I said, "for believing me, for helping me pursue this even though it complicates your life and puts us both at risk. You could have kept James's letters hidden, could have let me continue in ignorance, and I would never have known what I was missing." His hand came up to cover mine, pressing my palm more firmly against his cheek. "I should have given you this choice 3 years ago," he said quietly. "I should have trusted you with the truth instead of trying to protect you from it. I will not make that mistake again, Eleanor. Whatever we face in London, whatever danger comes from confronting Richard Hartwell, we face it together and with complete honesty between us." The kiss that followed was deeper than the one we had shared in the gallery, more certain, carrying the weight of genuine feeling rather than simply desire or duty. When we drew apart, both of us breathing hard, I saw in Alexander's eyes the same realization that was dawning in my own heart. What had begun as a marriage of convenience was transforming into something real, something that might survive even the revelations and dangers that lay ahead. We left for London 10 days later, our departure planned with the kind of meticulous attention to detail that characterized all of Alexander's undertakings. We traveled in the ducal carriage with a full complement of servants, making stops at country estates along the way to maintain the fiction that this was simply a routine journey to the city for the season. At each stop, we played our roles perfectly. The Duke and Duchess of Ashford, gracious and proper, betraying nothing of the investigation that consumed our private thoughts. London itself was a revelation to me. I had never visited the capital before, had spent all my remembered life in the quieter countryside where Ashford Manor held sway over its lands like a small kingdom unto itself. The city overwhelmed my senses with its noise and crowds and constant motion, the way thousands of lives pressed against each other in streets that never seemed to rest. But beneath my awe at the city's vitality, I felt a deeper recognition, as if some part of me remembered London from before, from the life I had lived as Eleanor Hartwell before fire and loss had erased me. The Ashford townhouse stood in Mayfair, an elegant structure of white stone and tall windows that spoke of wealth maintained across generations. Alexander had sent word ahead, and the house staff had prepared everything for our arrival, from fresh flowers in every room to a full schedule of social engagements that had been arranged during our absence. I reviewed the list of invitations with a growing sense of inevitability, noting the names of families I would need to charm, the dinners I would need to attend, the balls where I would need to smile and dance and pretend that my mind was not constantly calculating how to get close to Sir George Pemberton and Richard Hartwell without revealing my true purpose. Our first opportunity came sooner than expected. 3 days after our arrival in London, we received an invitation to a reception hosted by Lady Charlotte Pemberton, Sir George's wife, welcoming returned families to the city for the season. The invitation specified that Richard and Amelia Hartwell would be among the honored guests, as Lady Charlotte considered Amelia one of her dearest friends. I held the invitation in my hand and felt the weight of coincidence or fate, or perhaps simply the way London society wove itself together in predictable patterns. In 3 days, I would be in the same room as the man who had tried to kill me, the magistrate who had helped him cover his crimes, and all the glittering society that had embraced them both without question or doubt. "Are you ready for this?" Alexander asked, watching me read the invitation with concern evident in his expression. I looked up at him, at the man who had become so much more to me than simply a husband of convenience, and I felt a certainty settle over me that was part courage and part the recklessness of someone who has already survived her own death once. "Yes," I said. "I am ready to face Richard Hartwell and look him in the eye and see if he recognizes the child he thought he burned alive 15 years ago. I am ready to watch him pretend to be a gentleman while knowing what he really is. And I am ready to begin gathering the evidence that will bring him to justice, no matter how long it takes or what it costs." Alexander crossed to where I stood and took both my hands in his his grip firm and warm and anchoring. "Then we do this together," he said. "We go to Lady Pemberton's reception, and we play our parts perfectly, and we begin the careful work of unraveling Richard Hartwell's life thread by thread until we find the weakness that will make him confess. But promise me, Eleanor, that you will be careful, that you will not let your righteous anger drive you to confront him before we have the evidence to protect ourselves." "I promise," I said, and meant it, though part of me longed to walk up to Richard Hartwell at that reception and announce myself as Eleanor Hartwell returned from death to reclaim everything he had stolen. But I had learned patience during my years as an orphan, had learned to wait for the right moment rather than acting on impulse, and I would apply that same discipline now even as every instinct screamed for immediate justice. The night of the reception arrived with unseasonable warmth, the kind of spring evening that makes London almost beautiful despite its soot and crowds. I dressed in a gown of deep emerald silk, chosen specifically because the color made my eyes appear more green than gray, more striking and memorable. If Richard Hartwell was going to see me, I wanted him to see me clearly, to have every opportunity to recognize the child he had tried to erase, even if he did not know he was looking at her. Alexander waited for me at the bottom of the stairs, magnificent in his evening clothes, every inch the Duke whose lineage stretched back centuries. But when he looked up and saw me descending toward him, his expression shifted into something unguarded and admiring that made my breath catch. "You are formidable, Eleanor Hartwell," he said quietly, using my true name in a way that felt like both acknowledgement and blessing. "Richard Hartwell has no idea what is coming for him. Neither does London society," I replied, taking his offered arm and allowing him to lead me toward the carriage that would carry us to Lady Pemberton's house and the beginning of our carefully orchestrated justice. The reception was everything I had expected, glittering with candlelight and jewels, filled with conversation that was all surface polish with no depth beneath, decorated with flowers that must have cost more than most families earned in a year. I moved through it with Alexander at my side, smiling at introductions and making appropriate comments about the weather and the season and all the meaningless pleasantries that oiled the machinery of high society. But my eyes were always searching, always seeking, looking for the man who had tried to kill me and the magistrate who had helped him hide his crime. I found them standing together near the windows overlooking the garden, deep in conversation, and clearly comfortable with each other, in a way that spoke of long association. Sir George Pemberton was older than I had expected, perhaps 60 now, with white hair and the florid complexion of a man who enjoyed his wine too well. Richard Hartwell stood beside him, younger by a decade at least, handsome in a cold way that made me think of marble statues, beautiful but lifeless, lacking any warmth or genuine emotion. As I watched them, Richard laughed at something Sir George said, and the sound carried across the room like breaking glass. Sharp, cruel, the laugh of a man who believed himself untouchable. I felt Alexander's hand tighten on my arm, a warning and a reassurance both. "That is him," I said softly, more statement than question, though I had never seen Richard Hartwell before this moment. "Yes," Alexander confirmed. "That is the man who tried to murder you when you were 7 years old. The man who has lived for 15 years on wealth he stole through fire and deception. The man we are going to bring to justice." I watched Richard Hartwell standing in Lady Pemberton's reception room, surrounded by people who respected him, admired him, welcomed him into their homes and their society without the slightest suspicion that he was a murderer and a thief. And I felt something shift inside me, a hardening of resolve that was part rage and part the cold calculation of someone who understands that justice requires patience and strategy rather than immediate satisfaction. Richard Hartwell would fall. Sir George Pemberton would confess. The truth about the fire at Hartwell Hall would emerge from 15 years of darkness into the light of public knowledge and legal consequence. But not tonight. Tonight, I would simply observe. I would watch how Richard moved through society, who he spoke to, what vulnerabilities he might reveal in unguarded moments. I would begin building the detailed understanding of my enemy that would eventually allow me to destroy him completely. Alexander guided me forward, closer to where Richard and Sir George stood, positioning us so that an introduction would be natural and expected. As we approached, I kept my expression pleasant and my breathing steady, giving no sign of the fury and fear that warred inside me. Richard Hartwell turned as we came near, and for one heart-stopping moment, his eyes met mine. I saw them widen slightly, saw something flicker across his face that might have been recognition or simply surprise at being approached by the Duke of Ashford. Then his features smoothed into a practiced smile, and he was bowing with perfect courtesy, every inch the gentleman. "Your Grace," he said to Alexander, "what a pleasure to see you in London. And this must be the Duchess. I have heard much about your recent marriage." Alexander made the introductions with flawless propriety, and I extended my hand to Richard Hartwell, allowing him to bow over it in the accepted fashion. As his lips brushed the air above my gloved fingers, I studied his face intently, searching for any sign that he recognized me as the child he had tried to kill, that some part of him remembered the face from James's portrait, even if he could not place where he had seen it before. But Richard's expression revealed nothing beyond polite interest and the slight calculation of a man evaluating a new social connection for potential usefulness. When he released my hand and straightened, his smile was empty of everything except surface charm. He did not know me, could not see past the Duchess's elegant gown and sophisticated manner to recognize the 7-year-old girl who had planted roses in a garden he had ordered burned. And that, I realized, was exactly the advantage I needed. I smiled back at Richard Hartwell with perfect grace, playing the role of Duchess with every skill I had learned over 3 years of careful observation and practice. "A pleasure to meet you, Mr. Hartwell," I said. "I do hope we will have many opportunities to further our acquaintance this season." And as I spoke those words, committing myself to the long game of justice and revelation, I felt Alexander's presence beside me, like a promise. We were in this together, partners in truth-seeking and in the deeper bond that had grown between us during weeks of investigation and discovery. Richard Hartwell had no idea that his past had finally caught up to him, that the child he thought he had erased had returned to reclaim her name, her fortune, and her right to see him answer for his crimes. But he would learn. In time, with patience and careful planning, Richard Hartwell would learn exactly who I was and what he had failed to destroy 15 years ago in the flames of Hartwell Hall. And on that day, I would watch his face as recognition dawned and terror replaced his cold confidence. I would watch him fall, and I would feel no mercy. Only justice, earned through survival and reclaimed through courage. Only the truth, finally spoken after 15 years of silence. The weeks that followed that first meeting with Richard Hartwell became a careful dance of proximity and pretense. Alexander and I accepted invitations to the same dinners, balls, and garden parties where Richard and his wife Amelia appeared, always positioning ourselves close enough to observe, but never so close as to seem overly interested. I watched Richard move through London society with the confidence of a man who believed his secrets were safely buried, and I learned the patterns of his life with the attention of someone preparing for war. He was charming when he chose to be, I discovered, capable of making people feel seen and valued with nothing more than focused attention and well-timed compliments. He donated generously to charitable causes and served on the boards of several respected institutions. His wife Amelia was gentle and kind, beloved by the ladies of her social circle for her sweet temperament and genuine warmth. Their 3 children, when glimpsed at family gatherings, seemed happy and well cared for. To all outward appearances, Richard Hartwell was exactly what he claimed to be, a successful gentleman of means who had built a respectable life on the foundation of an inherited fortune. But I saw what others did not see, what they had no reason to look for. I saw how Richard's charm never quite reached his eyes, how his generosity was always calculated for maximum social benefit, how he watched other people with the cold assessment of someone evaluating assets and liabilities rather than engaging with fellow human beings. I saw how Sir George Pemberton deferred to him at gatherings, how conversations would quiet when Richard entered a room, how certain businessmen and politicians seemed eager to curry his favor. Richard Hartwell had built himself into a man of considerable power, and that power rested on the fortune he had stolen from my father and the murder he had committed to claim it. The realization of what I was truly facing settled over me like winter frost. This was not simply a matter of exposing one man's crime from 15 years past. This was about dismantling a web of influence and connection that Richard had spent more than a decade weaving throughout London's most powerful circles. Men like him did not fall easily, and when they did fall, they took others down with them in their desperation to save themselves. We need more than Mrs. Bennet's testimony, I told Alexander one evening as we prepared for yet another dinner where we would smile and dance and pretend we had no purpose beyond enjoying the season. We need evidence that connects Richard directly to the fire, proof that will stand up against the influence he has built. Letters, financial records, anything that shows he paid someone to set that fire or that he benefited directly from my father's death. Alexander helped me with the clasp of my necklace, his fingers brushing the nape of my neck in a touch that had become familiar and welcome over these weeks of partnership and growing intimacy. I have my solicitors searching for such records, he said. But Richard is careful. He has had 15 years to destroy evidence or hide it so thoroughly that we may never find it. Perhaps we need to consider a different approach. I turned to face him, reading the thoughtful expression that meant he had been considering our options with his usual strategic precision. What kind of approach? I asked. We bring James home from exile, Alexander said. We make it known that my brother has returned and that I have forgiven whatever past disagreements separated us. Richard does not know what James witnessed, does not know that James painted your portrait or kept detailed journals about the events at Hartwell Hall. If James is here in London, visible and vocal about his interest in art and old country houses, Richard may become nervous enough to make a mistake. Nervous men reveal things they meant to keep hidden. The idea had merit. I could see that immediately. James Ashford was the one witness whose testimony could directly contradict Richard's version of events, who could speak to the suspicious circumstances before the fire with the authority of someone who had been there and seen what others had missed. But bringing James home also meant acknowledging that Alexander had been wrong to exile him, that the madness Alexander had diagnosed was actually insight, that the brother he had dismissed and banished had been right all along. That is not an easy thing you are proposing, I said quietly. Admitting you were wrong about James, bringing him back into your life and the family after years of estrangement. Are you prepared for that? Alexander's hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing the curve of my cheekbone with a tenderness that still surprised me, even after weeks of discovering the depth of feeling he had kept hidden beneath his careful reserve. For you, Eleanor, he said, I am prepared to admit I was wrong about many things. I was wrong to dismiss James's concerns 3 years ago. I was wrong to marry you without telling you what he suspected about your identity. I was wrong to keep you at a distance because I was afraid of what it might mean to truly let you into my heart. If bringing James home helps us get justice for what was done to you, then I will swallow whatever pride it costs me and welcome my brother back with the apology he deserves. The kiss I gave him in response was answer and gratitude both, a wordless acknowledgement of how far we had traveled from the careful strangers who had married 3 years ago out of mutual convenience. What had grown between us during these weeks of investigation was something I had not allowed myself to hope for in the early years of our marriage. Genuine love, built on trust and partnership, and the kind of intimacy that comes from facing danger together. When we drew apart, both of us slightly breathless, Alexander rested his forehead against mine. I love you, Eleanor Hartwell, he said, speaking my true name like a vow. Whatever comes from confronting Richard, whatever danger we face. I need you to know that choosing you was the best decision I have ever made, even if I made it for reasons I did not fully understand at the time." "I love you too," I whispered back, feeling the truth of the words settle into my bones like coming home. "And I need you to know that whatever I discover about my past, whatever fortune or title I might reclaim, I choose this marriage. I choose us, not because I need the protection of your name or the security of your position, but because you are the partner I would choose even if I had 1,000 other options." We held each other for a long moment, drawing strength from the connection that had become the foundation of everything we were attempting to accomplish. Then we straightened, adjusting our evening clothes and our expressions, preparing to return to the performance of being nothing more than the Duke and Duchess of Ashford enjoying the London season. But first, Alexander had a letter to write, calling his brother home from exile. James Ashford arrived in London on a grey morning 2 weeks later, travelling under his own name with no attempt at disguise or secrecy. Alexander met him at the coaching inn alone, having insisted that I remain at the townhouse for this first reunion between brothers who had not spoken in 3 years. I waited in the drawing room, my hands folded in my lap to keep them from fidgeting, my mind running through all the ways this meeting might go wrong. When I finally heard voices in the entrance hall, I stood, my heart racing with anticipation and an anxiety I could not quite name. The door opened, and Alexander entered with another man at his side, and I saw immediately the family resemblance despite the differences between them. Where Alexander was all contained power and careful control, James was energy barely leashed, his movements quick, and his expression open in a way that suggested he had never learned to hide what he felt. He was younger than Alexander by several years, perhaps 30 now, with the same gray eyes but lighter hair, and a face that had not yet acquired the lines of responsibility and burden that marked his brother. But it was the way James stopped dead in the doorway when he saw me that took my breath away. His face went white, then flushed, and his eyes filled with tears that he made no attempt to hide. "Eleanor," he whispered, and the way he said my name carried 15 years of searching and hoping and refusing to give up, even when everyone told him he was chasing shadows and madness. I crossed the room to him. This man I had never met, but who had somehow saved me through the simple act of painting my portrait and refusing to forget. "Thank you," I said, and my own voice was thick with emotion I could not contain. "Thank you for painting me. Thank you for keeping me alive in memory when everyone else believed I was dead. Thank you for being right when everyone said you were wrong." James reached out and took both my hands in his, holding them as if I were something precious and fragile that might disappear if he let go. "I knew your face the moment I saw you," he said. "In Alexander's study 3 years ago, when he showed me the miniature of his intended bride and asked my opinion. I knew it was you, knew that somehow you had survived and found your way to safety. But he would not listen, would not investigate, and I made the mistake of pressing too hard, of seeming too obsessed, too desperate. I should have been more careful, should have presented my evidence more calmly, but I had searched for so long that finding you felt like witnessing a miracle, and I could not contain my certainty." Alexander moved to stand beside me, his presence solid and grounding. "You were right, brother," he said quietly, "about Eleanor's identity, about the danger she had survived, about Richard Hartwell's crimes. I was wrong to dismiss you, wrong to send you away, wrong about so many things. I cannot undo those 3 years of exile, but I can offer you my apology and my gratitude for refusing to abandon the truth even when it cost you everything." The two brothers looked at each other across a gulf of pain and misunderstanding and time, and I saw the moment when that gulf began to close, when forgiveness and renewed trust started to replace the bitterness of their separation. Then James was moving forward, pulling Alexander into an embrace that spoke of brotherhood restored and mistakes acknowledged, and the kind of second chances that not everyone receives, but that these two men had earned through honesty and humility both. I stepped back to give them privacy for their reunion, my eyes stinging with tears I did not try to hide. This was what justice looked like before it reached the courtroom, before the public revelation and legal consequences. This was family healing, truth acknowledged, love proving stronger than pride or pain. And I understood in that moment that whatever happened with Richard Hartwell, whatever fortune I might reclaim, or dangers I might face, I had already won something more valuable than any inheritance. I had found people who loved me enough to fight for me, who believed in me enough to risk everything for the truth, who chose me not because of what I represented, but because of who I was. When the brothers drew apart, both of them wiping at their eyes with no shame, James turned back to me with a smile that transformed his face from handsome to radiant. "I brought something for you," he said, reaching into the leather satchel he had set down by the door. "I have carried it with me for 3 years, ever since Alexander sent me away, because I knew that someday I would give it to you when we finally met." He withdrew a package wrapped in cloth and tied with string, and when he placed it in my hands, I knew before opening it what it must contain. My fingers trembled as I untied the string and pulled back the cloth to reveal a smaller version of the portrait that hung in the East Gallery at Ashford Manor. It showed the same young girl in the same blue dress, surrounded by the same glowing flowers. But this version was sized to be carried, to be kept close, to serve as a reminder and a promise both. "I painted this from memory," James said, "after I left Hartwell Hall but before the fire. I wanted to have a copy I could show to people when I searched for you, proof that you had existed, evidence of what you looked like. I have shown this painting in every orphanage and parish church and workhouse between Cornwall and Scotland, asking if anyone had seen a girl who matched this face. And now, finally, I can give it to you. Not as evidence of a search, but as a gift from someone who never stopped believing you would be found." I clutched the small portrait to my chest, feeling the solid weight of it, the proof of one man's faith in my survival made tangible. "This is the most precious thing anyone has ever given me," I said, "not because of the skill of the painting, though that is extraordinary, but because it represents hope maintained against all reason, love for a child you barely knew, dedication to truth even when it cost you everything." Alexander moved to stand behind me, his hands coming to rest on my shoulders in a gesture of support and possession both. "Now we need to use that dedication to bring Richard Hartwell to justice," he said. "James, are you willing to testify to what you witnessed at Hartwell Hall? To speak publicly about the conversations you overheard, the suspicious circumstances you observed, the reasons you believed Eleanor's life was in danger?" James's expression hardened with determination. "I have been waiting 3 years for someone to ask me that question," he said. "Yes, I will testify. I will tell everything I know, everything I saw, everything I suspected, but could not prove. And I will face Richard Hartwell in court and watch him answer for what he did. Then we have our witness," I said, feeling pieces of our investigation clicking into place like a puzzle finally revealing its complete picture. "Mrs. Bennet can testify to Richard's presence at Hartwell Hall before the fire and to finding my father drugged with laudanum. James can testify to the conversations about removing me from the picture and to Richard's suspicious behavior. Combined with the financial records Alexander's solicitors are uncovering and my own existence as proof that the official story about the fire was incomplete, we have the foundation of a case that even Richard's influence cannot easily dismiss. But we need one more thing," Alexander said. "We need Richard to incriminate himself. We need him to say something, do something, reveal something that proves his guilt beyond any doubt. And that means we need to make him nervous, pressure him just enough that he makes a mistake." "How do we do that?" James asked, and I heard in his voice the same fierce determination I felt burning in my own chest. I met Alexander's eyes, seeing my own thoughts reflected there. "We tell him the truth," I said, "or at least part of it. We let it be known that the Duke of Ashford has reconciled with his brother the artist, that James has returned from exile and has begun painting again. We mention casually in the right social circles that James is considering painting a series based on his memories of old country estates he visited as a young man. And we wait to see how Richard reacts when he hears that the artist who painted Eleanor Hartwell's portrait is back in London and talking about the past. It is risky, Alexander warned. If Richard feels genuinely threatened, he may move against us directly. We would be painting a target on ourselves and inviting him to act. Good, I said, and I heard the steel in my own voice, the part of me that had survived fire and loss and 15 years of not knowing who I was or why I mattered. Let him act. Let him reveal himself. Let him make the mistake that will finally bring him down. I am tired of hiding, tired of pretending, tired of watching him live freely on wealth he stole from my father and from me. If making him nervous brings him out into the open, then that is what we must do. James nodded his agreement, his artist's hands clenching into fists. I left England 3 years ago because my brother gave me no choice, he said. But I dreamed every night of coming home and finally making people listen to what I knew about Richard Hartwell. If this is our chance to do that, I am ready to take whatever risks come with it. Alexander looked between his brother and his wife, and I saw the moment when he made his decision, when he committed fully to the dangerous path we were proposing. Very well, he said. We proceed with the plan. James, you will begin attending the same social events where Richard appears. You will speak loudly enough to be overheard about your memories of painting at Hartwell Hall, about the commission you received from Lord Edmund Hartwell, about the fascinating family dynamics you observed during that summer. Eleanor and I will make certain that information reaches Richard through the gossip channels that keep London society entertained, and we will all watch carefully for Richard's response. And so we became hunters instead of merely investigators, stalking our prey through drawing rooms and dinner parties, and the carefully orchestrated social calendar of London's elite. James reintegrated himself into society with surprising ease, his artistic reputation and his connection to the Duke of Ashford opening doors that might otherwise have remained closed. He was charming and talented and genuinely likable, and within days of his return, half of London seemed to know that James Ashford was back from his continental travels and more fascinating than ever. I watched him work at a dinner party 2 weeks after his arrival, holding forth to a group of ladies about the beautiful estates he had visited as a young artist. Hartwell Hall was one of my favorite commissions, he said, his voice carrying across the room in a way that seemed natural but that I knew was carefully calculated. The estate itself was magnificent, though it burned down years ago under tragic circumstances. I remember Lord Edmund Hartwell and his daughter Eleanor, such a lovely child. I often wonder what became of her. I was standing near enough to see Richard Hartwell's reaction, the way his wineglass stilled halfway to his lips, the slight tightening around his eyes that was the only visible sign of tension. He recovered quickly, his expression smoothing back into polite interest. But I had seen that momentary crack in his composure, and it gave me fierce satisfaction. He knows, I whispered to Alexander, who stood beside me monitoring Richard's response with the same intensity I felt. He heard James mention my name, and he knows that someone remembers me, remembers what he tried to erase. Now we see what he does with that knowledge, Alexander replied quietly. Whether he stays confident in his own security, or whether he begins making the mistakes of a man who feels his past catching up to him. The answer came 3 days later, delivered not through Richard himself, but through Sir George Pemberton. The old magistrate appeared at the Ashford townhouse unannounced, requesting a private meeting with Alexander on a matter of some delicacy and urgency. I was not invited to attend this meeting, but Alexander ensured I was positioned in an adjacent room where I could hear every word through the door he left strategically ajar. "Your Grace," Sir George began, his voice carrying the pompous formality of a man who took his own importance very seriously. "I come to you as a friend, and as someone concerned about the company your brother has been keeping since his return to London." Alexander's response was perfectly calibrated confusion. I am not aware that James keeps any unsuitable company, Sir George. Perhaps you could be more specific about your concerns. Sir George cleared his throat with obvious discomfort. It has come to my attention that your brother has been speaking rather freely about his time at Hartwell Hall before the unfortunate fire that claimed Lord Edmund and his daughter. Such reminiscences, while no doubt innocent in themselves, have caused some distress to Mr. Richard Hartwell, who finds it painful to have that tragic period of his family's history continually brought up in casual conversation. I pressed my hand against the doorframe, forcing myself to breathe slowly and quietly, to remain hidden even though every instinct wanted to burst into that room and confront Sir George with the truth about his complicity in Richard's crimes. Alexander's voice, when he responded, carried just the right note of aristocratic confusion. I fail to see why Mr. Hartwell should find it distressing for my brother to discuss his own memories of an estate where he was commissioned to work. Surely, James has every right to speak of his experiences as an artist, even if the location later met with tragedy. Of course, Sir George said quickly. It is simply that Mr. Hartwell has expressed concern that these reminiscences might lead to awkward speculation about the circumstances of the fire. You understand, Your Grace, how easily London society can turn innocent remarks into damaging gossip. Mr. Hartwell has built a respectable life since inheriting the Hartwell fortune, and he would prefer not to have that stability threatened by well-meaning but potentially harmful discussions of the past. And there it was, delivered with all the subtlety of a hammer. Richard Hartwell was worried about speculation, concerned that James's memories might lead to questions about the fire, anxious enough to send his old accomplice to warn the Duke of Ashford away from dangerous topics. It was not quite a confession, not quite proof of guilt, but it was the first clear indication that our strategy was working, that Richard felt threatened enough to act. I will speak to my brother about exercising more discretion in his reminiscences, Alexander said, his tone suggesting nothing beyond mild concern for social niceties. I would not want James to inadvertently cause distress to anyone through careless conversation. Sir George's relief was audible even through the door. Thank you, Your Grace. I knew you would understand the delicacy of the situation. Mr. Hartwell will be most grateful for your cooperation in this matter. After Sir George departed, Alexander came to find me where I stood in the adjacent room, my hands clenched at my sides and my heart racing with the implications of what we had just heard. Richard is frightened, Alexander said, stating the obvious truth that we both recognized. Frightened enough to send Pemberton as a warning, to try to silence James before his memories lead to questions Richard cannot safely answer. Then we push harder, I said. We make it clear that James will not be silenced, that the truth about Hartwell Hall deserves to be told regardless of who finds it uncomfortable. And we watch Richard Hartwell very carefully, because a frightened man with a history of violence is the most dangerous kind of enemy. Alexander pulled me into his arms, holding me close in a gesture that was equal parts comfort and solidarity. We are close, Eleanor, he said against my hair. Close to justice, close to truth, close to making Richard answer for what he did to you and your father. But we must be careful now, more careful than we have been. Richard knows we are a threat, even if he does not yet understand exactly what we know. He will be watching us as carefully as we watch him. I nodded against his chest, drawing strength from his solid presence. I was ready for the final confrontation that was coming, ready to face Richard Hartwell and force him to acknowledge what he had done. The game of proximity and pretense was ending, and soon the time for masks and carefully maintained lies would be over. Soon, Richard Hartwell would learn that Eleanor Hartwell had returned from death to reclaim her name, her fortune, and her right to see justice done. And I would be there to watch truth finally triumph over 15 years of lies. The confrontation came not in a courtroom or a drawing room, but in the most unlikely of places, the ruins of Hartwell Hall itself. Alexander had arranged for us to travel there under the pretense of James wanting to sketch the remains of the estate where he had once worked, a perfectly reasonable artistic impulse that gave us cover for what was actually a calculated provocation. We made certain that Richard Hartwell heard of our plans through Lady Pemberton, who could be relied upon to pass along any interesting gossip to her husband, who would in turn inform Richard that the Ashfords were visiting the site of his greatest crime. We traveled in early summer, when the days stretched long and golden across the English countryside. The ruins of Hartwell Hall stood in a valley between gentle hills, the blackened stone walls rising like broken teeth against the sky. Nature had begun to reclaim what fire had destroyed, vines creeping through empty window frames and wildflowers growing in what had once been grand entrance halls. Standing there in the wreckage of my childhood home, I felt memories stirring like ghosts, insubstantial but persistent, offering glimpses of the life I had lived before fire and loss had erased me. James set up his easel near what remained of the east wing, sketching the ruins with an artist's practiced hand, while Alexander and I walked through rooms that existed now only as outlines on scorched ground. I could not remember the layout of the house with any certainty, but my feet seemed to know where they were going, carrying me through spaces my conscious mind had forgotten, but my body remembered. Here was where the drawing room had been, where my mother had played the pianoforte on winter evenings. There was the library where my father had read to me from books of poetry and history, and beyond that ruined wall had stood the nursery where I had slept. The room I had escaped from on the night of the fire through means I still could not quite recall. We had been there perhaps an hour when we heard the sound of horse hooves on the road that led to the ruins. Alexander's hand found mine immediately, his grip tight with tension and readiness both. James set down his charcoal and moved to stand with us, the three of us forming a united front as we watched Richard Hartwell ride into view. He came alone, which surprised me. I had expected him to bring Sir George or some other ally, someone who might serve as witness or support. Instead, he dismounted from his horse with the careful movements of a man who had made a decision and was committed to seeing it through regardless of consequences. He was dressed for riding, his clothes expensive but practical, and he carried himself with the same cold confidence I had observed at every London gathering where we had crossed paths. But as he approached us through the ruins of the house he had ordered burned, I saw something in his face that had not been visible in the candle-lit drawing rooms and elegant ballrooms of society. Fear. Real fear. Barely masked beneath his aristocratic composure. Fear of discovery. Fear of consequences. Fear of the past that he had thought safely buried, rising up to destroy everything he had built on the foundation of murder and theft. "Your Grace," he said to Alexander, nodding with a courtesy that seemed absurd given the circumstances. "Mr. Ashford and Duchess, I was informed that you planned to visit this location, and I felt it necessary to speak with you about the wisdom of such an excursion." Alexander's voice, when he responded, carried all the authority of generations of ducal power. The wisdom of visiting the ruins of an estate where my brother once worked? "I fail to see how our presence here requires your approval or input, Mr. Hartwell." Richard's jaw tightened, and I saw him struggling to maintain his composure in the face of Alexander's cold dismissal. "It is simply that this location holds painful memories for my family," he said. "My cousin and his daughter died here, and having their tragedy treated as the subject of artistic curiosity feels disrespectful to their memory." I stepped forward then, unable to remain silent any longer, tired of pretending and performing and hiding behind the mask of the Duchess who did not know her own history. "Is that what you tell yourself, Mr. Hartwell, that they died here? That this was tragedy rather than murder?" Richard's eyes snapped to my face, and in that moment I saw recognition dawn. Not immediate, not complete, but a dawning awareness that there was something familiar about me, something that connected me to this place in ways he had not previously understood. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice dropping to something barely above a whisper. "I am Eleanor Hartwell," I said, speaking my true name aloud to the man who had tried to erase it. "Daughter of Lord Edmund Hartwell. The child who was supposed to die in the fire you ordered set, who was supposed to disappear so completely that you could claim her inheritance without challenge or complication. But I did not die, Mr. Hartwell. I survived. And I have returned to reclaim what you stole from me." The color drained from Richard's face, leaving him pale as the broken stones that surrounded us. "It is not possible," he said. "You died in the fire. There were no survivors except Edmund, and he died of his injuries 3 days later. This is some kind of trick, some elaborate fraud." James moved to stand beside me, his presence solid and reassuring. "I painted her portrait 15 years ago," he said, "before the fire. I witnessed your visits to Hartwell Hall, heard your conversations with Lord Edmund about removing his daughter from the picture so you could inherit. I documented everything in journals that are now in the possession of the Duke of Ashford's solicitors, and I have spent the last 15 years searching for the child I knew had survived, because I saw you speaking with the man you paid to set that fire, watched you plan every detail of your crime." Richard's hand moved to his horse's saddle, as if he were considering mounting and riding away, escaping this confrontation the same way he had escaped justice for 15 years. But Alexander had positioned himself between Richard and his horse, and I knew my husband would not let this man leave until we had the confession we needed. "We have witnesses," Alexander said. "Mrs. Martha Bennet, your cousin's housekeeper, who saw you meeting with the arsonist in the days before the fire, who found Lord Edmund drugged with laudanum that you provided. Sir George Pemberton, who has agreed to testify about the bribes you paid him to close the investigation quickly and declare the fire an accident. And we have financial records that show how you profited from your cousin's death, how you used the Hartwell fortune to build your current position in society. What we do not have yet, Mr. Hartwell, is your confession. But we will have it, one way or another. The only question is whether you give it freely or whether we extract it through legal proceedings that will destroy not only you, but your wife and children as well." I watched Richard's face as he processed this information, saw him calculating his options and finding them all equally damaging. He could deny everything, force us to take him to court, drag his family through the public scandal of a trial. Or he could confess now, privately, and perhaps negotiate some terms that would spare his wife and children the worst of the social consequences. Either way, he had lost. The past he thought he had successfully buried had risen up to consume him, and there was no escape available that would preserve the life he had built on lies and murder. The silence stretched between us, broken only by the wind moving through the ruins and the distant call of birds settling for the evening. I stood in the wreckage of my childhood home and waited for the man who had destroyed it to finally speak the truth. When Richard finally spoke, his voice was barely audible, all his confidence stripped away. "I never meant for Edmund to die," he said. "That was an accident, a miscalculation of the laudanum dose. I only wanted him unconscious so he would not interfere with the fire. The child was supposed to be removed before the flames were set, taken somewhere far away where she could not return to make claims on the inheritance. But the man I hired was drunk that night, careless. He set the fire too early, before the child was taken. I thought she had died in the flames because of his incompetence." "So you admit it," I said, my voice steady despite the rage and grief that warred inside me. "You admit you planned my father's death, that you ordered Hartwell Hall burned, that you intended to kidnap me and remove me from my own life so you could steal what belonged to my family. You admit that you have lived for 15 years on a fortune gained through murder and deception." Richard looked at me then, really looked at me, and I saw in his eyes something I had not expected. Regret. Not remorse for the crime itself, not genuine repentance, but regret that he had been caught, that his carefully constructed life was about to come crashing down around him. "Yes," he said, "I admit it all. What choice do I have now? You have me cornered, and I see no path forward that does not end in my destruction." Alexander produced a document from his coat, pages that his solicitors had prepared in anticipation of this moment. "Then you will sign this confession, detailing everything you have just told us and providing evidence that can be verified through independent sources. You will also sign over all assets that were derived from the Hartwell fortune, returning them to Eleanor as the rightful heir, and you will turn yourself over to the magistrate for formal charges to be filed." Richard took the document with shaking hands, reading through it with the careful attention of a man who understood he was signing away everything he had built. "His wife," he said after a long moment. "My children. What will become of them?" I thought of Amelia Hartwell, the gentle woman who had married a monster without knowing what he truly was. I thought of their children, innocent of their father's crimes, but destined to carry the stain of them for the rest of their lives. And I found that despite everything Richard had done to me, I could not wish harm on those who had not chosen his path. "Your wife will be provided for," I said. "A portion of the estate will be set aside to ensure she and your children do not suffer destitution because of your crimes. They will have enough to live modestly, away from London society perhaps, but with dignity and security. That is more mercy than you showed my father or me, but I will not punish the innocent for your sins." Richard's eyes filled with tears then, the first genuine emotion I had seen from him. "Thank you," he whispered. "I do not deserve such consideration, but thank you for showing my family more compassion than I showed yours." He signed the confession with a hand that trembled, each stroke of the pen a surrender and an acknowledgement both. When he finished, he handed the document back to Alexander and stood waiting, as if unsure what came next, now that his life as he had known it was effectively over. "There is one more thing," I said, my voice carrying across the ruins with a strength I had not known I possessed. "I need to know how I survived that night. Who took me from this house before the flames consumed it? Who saved me when everyone believed I had died?" Richard shook his head slowly. "I do not know," he said. "The man I hired, the arsonist, disappeared after the fire. He was supposed to report to me, to confirm that everything had gone as planned, but he never came. I assumed he had fled in panic after realizing he had killed a child, that he feared being caught and had gone into hiding. For years I waited for him to surface, to try to blackmail me with what he knew, but he never did. If someone saved you that night, it was not part of my plan, and I have no knowledge of who it might have been. The mystery of my survival would remain unsolved then, at least for now. Someone had pulled me from the burning house, had carried me away to safety, and delivered me to an orphanage where I would be cared for, but not remembered. Perhaps it had been the drunken arsonist himself, overcome with guilt at what he had done. Perhaps it had been a servant who had escaped the flames and acted on instinct to save a child. Perhaps I would never know who I owed my life to, and I would have to make peace with that uncertainty. But I knew who I was now. I knew where I had come from and what had been taken from me. I knew my father had loved me despite his weaknesses, that my mother had planted roses with me in gardens that no longer existed, that I had a right to the name and fortune and history that were mine by birth. And I knew that I had found love and partnership and a future worth fighting for in the marriage that had begun as convenience and had transformed into something far more profound. Alexander called for the local magistrate then, a different man than Sir George Pemberton, someone with no connection to Richard and no reason to protect him. As Richard was taken into custody, formally charged with murder and fraud and conspiracy, I stood in the ruins of Hartwell Hall and felt 15 years of questions finally receiving their answers. The weeks that followed were difficult in ways I had not fully anticipated. Richard's confession and arrest sent shockwaves through London society, destroying reputations and forcing powerful people to reconsider alliances they had built with a man now revealed as a murderer. Sir George Pemberton was removed from his position as magistrate and faced his own charges for accepting bribes and obstructing justice. The Hartwell fortune was returned to me through legal channels that took months to fully resolve, bringing with it responsibilities and decisions I had never imagined making. But through it all, Alexander was beside me, his steady presence and unwavering support carrying me through moments when the weight of revelation and restoration threatened to overwhelm. James, too, remained close, his artistic eye capturing scenes from my recovered past, and his friendship offering a connection to the child I had been before fire and loss had reshaped me. And Mrs. Bennet came to London to testify at Richard's trial, embracing me with tears and apologies for not having saved me herself on that terrible night. The trial itself was mercifully brief. Richard pled guilty to all charges, his signed confession eliminating the need for prolonged legal proceedings. He was sentenced to transportation to Australia, a punishment that removed him from England but spared him the hangman's noose, partly because of his cooperation and partly because I had spoken on behalf of mercy for his family's sake. Amelia Hartwell and her children retired to the countryside on the income I had settled on them, and I heard later that Amelia had written me a letter of gratitude that I kept but could never quite bring myself to answer. On a morning in late autumn, nearly a year after I had first discovered the portrait in the East Gallery of Ashford Manor, Alexander and I stood in the gardens of the newly restored Hartwell Hall. I had chosen to rebuild rather than let the ruins stand as a monument to tragedy, had hired architects and craftsmen to create something new from the ashes of what had been lost. The house that rose from those foundations was not a replica of what my father had built, but something different, something that honored the past while embracing a future I was choosing for myself. James had painted a new portrait to hang in the entrance hall, this one showing me not as the child I had been, but as the woman I had become. I stood in the gardens I remembered, surrounded by roses that had been replanted from cuttings preserved by the gardener who had worked here 15 years ago, and who had returned now to tend them once more. Behind me in the painting stood Alexander, his hand on my shoulder in a gesture that spoke of partnership and love, and in my arms I held our infant daughter, born 6 months after Richard's trial, named Catherine, after the mother I barely remembered, but whose love I carried forward into the next generation. "Do you have regrets?" Alexander asked, as we stood together looking at the rebuilt house that represented both my reclaimed past and our shared future. Regrets about pursuing the truth, about confronting Richard, about choosing to rebuild here rather than simply remaining at Ashford Manor as the Duchess you had become. I turned to face him, this man who had started as a husband of convenience and had become the great love of my life, the partner who had stood with me through danger and revelation and the slow work of restoration. "No regrets," I said, "only gratitude. Gratitude that you believed me when the portrait demanded belief. Gratitude that you chose truth over comfort, justice over ease. Gratitude that you loved me enough to help me become not just the Duchess of Ashford, but Eleanor Hartwell reclaimed and restored." He kissed me then, there in the gardens where roses bloomed, and our daughter slept peacefully in the nursery above, and I tasted the sweetness of a future earned through courage and conviction, and the refusal to let the past remain buried when it deserved to be spoken. James called to us from the terrace, where he was setting up to paint the gardens in the golden afternoon light. He had never left England again after returning from exile, had found his place in our household and our family, the brother and friend and witness, whose paintings now graced galleries throughout London. He waved for us to join him, eager to show us his latest work, and Alexander and I walked hand in hand across lawns that had been replanted and gardens that had been reborn. I thought about the girl in the portrait, the child who had hummed to herself while planting roses with her mother's memory held close. I thought about the orphan who had arrived at Whitmore with no name and no past, who had survived through adaptability and determination. I thought about the Duchess who had wandered into a forbidden gallery and found a portrait that changed everything. And I thought about the woman I had become through all of those transformations. Eleanor Hartwell, survivor and heir, wife and mother, someone who had learned that identity is not simply given, but claimed, that justice requires patience and courage, that love can grow in the most unlikely circumstances and become the foundation for everything else worth having. The portrait in the East Gallery of Ashford Manor still hung where James had left it 15 years ago, a testament to one man's refusal to let a child be forgotten. But now it was joined by new portraits, new memories, new stories being written in the space between past and present. The girl in the garden had grown into a woman who knew her own name, who had faced the man who tried to erase her, and had emerged victorious, who had chosen to rebuild rather than retreat, to remember rather than forget, to love rather than simply endure. I was Eleanor Hartwell, daughter of Edmund and Catherine, wife of Alexander, mother of the next generation that would carry our combined legacies forward. I was the child who had survived fire, and the woman who had reclaimed her inheritance. I was the orphan who had found family, and the Duchess who had discovered that titles matter less than truth. That position means nothing without purpose, that the only power worth having is the power to choose your own path and walk it with courage. And as I stood in the gardens of Hartwell Hall, with my husband beside me, and my brother-in-law calling us to witness beauty being captured on canvas, and my daughter sleeping peacefully in the nursery above, I understood that this was what justice looked like in its fullest form. Not simply punishment for crimes committed, but restoration of what had been taken. Not simply exposure of lies, but the rebuilding of truth. Not simply survival, but the claiming of a life lived fully and without apology. The portrait had been painted by a stranger who became family. The Duchess had whispered warnings that led to revelation. And the man who had tried to destroy me had instead, through his crimes and his failure, given me the opportunity to discover who I truly was and what I was capable of becoming. I had been erased by fire and reborn through love. I had lost a childhood and gained a future. I had survived when I was supposed to die, and in that survival had found not just existence, but purpose, not just safety, but passion, not just a name, but an identity earned through every choice I had made since discovering that portrait hanging in the shadows of a forgotten gallery. The roses bloomed around us, their fragrance sweet and heavy in the autumn air, and I bent to touch one that grew near the path where my mother had once taught me to tend them. The petals were soft beneath my fingers, alive and growing, proof that even after fire and loss and 15 years of absence, beauty could return to places that had known only destruction. And in that moment, with my husband's hand warm in mine, and the sound of my daughter's contented breathing drifting from the nursery window and the future stretching before us like gardens waiting to be planted, I knew with absolute certainty that I was finally, completely, irrevocably home. Not home in the sense of returning to a place I had left, though Hartwell Hall was that too. But home in the deeper meaning of the word, at peace with my past, confident in my present, and joyfully anticipating the future that Alexander and I would build together on foundations of truth and love, and the kind of partnership that could weather any storm. The portrait in the gallery had started it all, a painted face staring back at me across 15 years. But the real portrait, the one that mattered most, was the life I was living now, not frozen in oils and canvas, but growing and changing and becoming more fully itself with each passing day. I was Eleanor Hartwell. I was the Duchess of Ashford. I was wife and mother and survivor and heir. I was all of these things and more, and I would spend the rest of my life learning the full measure of what it meant to be myself, without apology, without fear, without the weight of unknowing that had shadowed me for so long. The stranger who had painted my portrait had given me the gift of being remembered, but I had given myself something even more valuable: the courage to remember, the strength to reclaim, and the wisdom to understand that our truest identity is not found in what others call us, but in who we choose to become when faced with truth and given the freedom to decide our own path forward. And I chose this: love over bitterness, rebuilding over ruin, truth over comfortable lies, and a future shaped by hope rather than haunted by a past I could finally, blessedly, lay to rest. The portrait had asked a question across 15 years of silence, and I had answered it with my life reclaimed, my name restored, and my heart finally, completely home.